Hey guys, and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture, we are going to look at the Civil War. We're going to look on the reflections on the Civil War. We're going to analyze the causes and the study of the war. And to just recap what we discussed in our last lecture. In our last lecture, we conducted a similar analysis. We looked at we looked at the key battles of the Civil War: Antietam, Chancellorsville, Atlanta, Vicksburg, and of course Gettysburg. Looking at the outcome of the battles and how the battles influenced the political scene at the time. Excuse me again. Okay. And now, with our recap done, I'd like to dive right into our lecture, our discussion on our reflections on the Civil War. And so now it is commonly stated that the United States Civil War was fought over slavery. The free states opposed it, and the slave states supported it. Now, that type of view led to people like William Seward issuing statements like there was a irrepressible conflict in the Republic that was about to rear its ugly head. Now, in history, there exists a major risk in naming a single cause as the determinative factor for any event or phase. But with the United States Civil War, there can be no doubt that slavery was the cause. The states had disagreed over slavery since the founding of the Republic. Political leaders have been able to, on a regular basis, reach compromises on the issue until 1860. The abolition of slavery was a major priority for a minority in the Republican Party. The preservation of slavery was a major priority for a majority of their rival party. The victory of either was seen as just unbearable for the other. The victory of the Republican Party, even though Lincoln was a moderate, even though Lincoln had promised not to touch slavery where it already existed, the fact that he was willing to bar slavery in the territories was too much to bear. It was just too much. You couldn't have someone with those type of radical beliefs in power, at least from the perspective of the pro-slavery forces. And the anti-slavery forces, they were just as fanatical, just as upset. They argued that you could not have someone who, people who could not accept the ballot, people who stomped their feet and became petulant little children because they did not get the way at the ballot, because they could not handle a political loss. So those two events sort of edged the nation closer and closer. The call-up for volunteers, those 75,000 initial volunteers after the shelling or the attack, the bombardment of Fort Sumter. That attack led to the call-up of 75,000 men, and those men were called up to suppress the rebellion and preserve the republic. They were not called up to end the slavery, to suppress slavery. We also have to note that well over the majority of the slave state citizens did not own slaves. But we also have to caption that was well over the majority of the slave states citizens did not have wealth or political power. So we also have to examine slavery as being something that not everyone had access to in the South. Slaves were something that not everyone had access to in the South, but access to slaves often equaled personal wealth and political power, or at least access to political power and access to greater personal wealth. Now, since the end of the United States Civil War, there has been a consistent and well-articulated argument that states' rights, in addition to a host of other factors and not slavery, was the motivation for secession. Now, slavery, regardless, was the central factor for the Civil War, but it is not the central factor in the Civil War, not in the ways that most people, most citizens of the Republic now or then or any time in between view it. Citizens of the Republic and the Free States through 1860s, the revisionists who thought of it or who examined the war in the years immediately following, and us, people living in the present, we don't view it in the same way as the cause. And to really begin our examination of the Civil War and its causes, we have to go back about a decade. We have to go back to the 1850s, to those turbulent 1850s. As we covered in our lectures on the 1850s, slavery was not the main concern of the citizens of the Republic. The Western territories were. But the main concern with the Western territories was whether they be open to slavery or not, whether slavery will be permitted to expand into said territories was the hot button issue, and it was a pressing issue throughout the 1850s. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed popular sovereignty to be used to decide if whether slavery would be allowed in the remaining portion of the old Louisiana Purchase country, which had been closed to slavery by the Missouri Compromise. And this set off a firestorm of emotions across the Republic. These emotions flared into the destabilizing and turbulent event known as Bleeding Kansas. Now, ironically, heavy cash crop cultivation based on slavery had practiced in the slave states was totally and still is totally unsuitable in Kansas. This Kansas-Nebraska Act, as we noted earlier, led to the disintegration of the Whig Party, paving the way for the founding of the Republican Party, which resulted in a political shift. Now this political shift led the two major parties, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, being calibrated on totally sectional voter basis. Prior to this, both the National Party, both the two main parties, had just about equal voter basis in both the slave states and the free states. Now, the key issues of the election of 1860, none of the issues were slavery, but the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the status of the other territories. The expansion of slavery into those territories were factors of them. Economic issues overwhelmed slavery. Domestic tariffs issues overwhelmed slavery, and the territories overwhelmed slavery. But it must be noted that in each of those instances, slavery was a major determining factor, particularly with the territories. The issue with the territories was whether slavery will be permitted or not. That cannot be underscored. And Lincoln won with a minority of votes, but he managed to carry all of the free states and thus garnered a majority in the Electoral College. Now, his election spurred first South Carolina and then 6 other slave states and the deep slave states south. Those deep slave states to rebel, to secede from the Union. With the outbreak of hostilities at Fort Sumter in 1861 and the call up for rebellion, 4 more slave states, this time in the Upper South, seceded from the Union. The call for troops, it must be said again, was to suppress the rebellion and to preserve the Union, not abolish slavery or in any way interfere with the practice of slavery where it already existed. Throughout the first year and a half of the United States Civil War, Lincoln and the United States, by extension, had been willing to offer guarantees of protection to slavery where it already existed by calling for a prohibition to the expansion of slavery. They've been willing to grant those protections and only call for the prohibition to the expansion of slavery. It must be said again. Only prohibiting slavery in the territory. That was the only thing Lincoln and the Republican Party wanted. Any protections, it must be said that they would give them. Lincoln said, if I can save the Union without freeing any slave, I will do it. He also said that if I were free the slave, that if it cost me freeing all the slaves to save the Union, I do that as well. Those are things that Lincoln said. Those are sentiments that he expressed. In 1862, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamations. The preliminary proclamation in 1862 and the actual proclamation in 1863 on January 1st. These were war measures meant to lull the rebelling slave states back into the Union. The proclamations did not free any slave. The proclamations did not apply to the slave states, to slave owners who were loyal to the United States. Or the territories of the slave states that were already under United States military control. The Emancipation Proclamation would only be applied to those areas outside of the control of the United States and still in a state of insurrection, aka rebellion, against the United States government. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation continued the trend of the United States government of confiscating the property of the citizens of the Confederate States. Now, in light of these facts, historians of the United States Civil War, beginning in the early 20th century, began to reevaluate the role of slavery in the United States Civil War. The first of these revisionist thinkers focused on the old argument of states' rights versus federal power. And in 1868, Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederate States, stated that it was states' rights. States' rights was the real cause of the Civil War. Stephens, in his defense of secession and his states' rights argument, stated from the beginning this was not a contest between the advocates or opponents of that peculiar institution. In previous lectures, we discussed how slavery was a domestic institution. By peculiar institution, he meant slavery. Slavery was known as the peculiar domestic institution of the slave states. Getting back to what Stephen said, this is not a contest between the advocates or opponents of that peculiar institution, aka slavery, but a contest between the supporters of a strictly federative government on the one side and a thoroughly national one on the other. And by federative government, he meant the government in which there was a union, a federation of states, but the states held all the power while the federal government didn't. And by a thoroughly national one, he meant one in which the national government held the power and the states were in a secondary role. And he goes on to say that it was this strife between the principles of federation and centralism that led to the war. Now, this conflict, the states' right conflict, was nothing new. It had existed since the founding of the Republic. The Bill of Rights came about because of fears over this, because of states' fears over the role and the powers of this central government, this central or national government. Now, Now these fears had existed since the very beginning of the republic. The argument from the beginning of the republic was whether the national government was subordinate to the states and thus possessing only limited powers, or was it a union of the people possessing strong implied powers and thus possessing broad, unchallenged powers over the states. Now, throughout our lectures on the early republic, we have seen that the slave states held the position that the federal government had strong powers and that the free states supported states' rights. The states' rights argument was actually more supported by the free states than the slave states. That being said, many people in the United States hold this reverse understanding and thus refer to and thus hold to it that the Civil War was a war between states' rights advocates in the slave states who had always been states' rights advocates. Now, when we analyze the development of states' rights arguments, we see that it does begin with the slave states. For example, Hamilton and Madison, they both penned the very famous, or in some cases infamous, Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. To really just show their discontent with the way that the Adams administration, the Federalist Adams administration, was going about business. These are the first those two documents, and this stance is the first instance of states' rights being applied to the federal government. It did not lead to a groundswell of support. It did not really inspire any new pieces of legislation, any new documents on the push for states' rights. What it did do was set a precedent for anybody who was on the outside of federal power to go ahead and argue for states' rights, to sort of advocate, to sort of use states' rights as a political tool to push their own agenda so that they wouldn't be politically marginalized. And when we move on from those two, from Madison and Jefferson, we move on from them in the late 1790s to the New England states in the 1810s. During the War of 1812, the New England states prominently supported states' rights over federal power before and during the War of 1812. Had Federalists were most strongest in New England. The New England states opposed everything that the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson and Madison had done, were doing. They were consistently a thorn in their heel. The New England states again took up states' rights argument and supported used states' rights to voice their displeasure with the adventuring of the United States during the Mexican War in 1848. And again, it's interesting to point out that the states' rights argument in the United States, in United States history, is used consistently by whatever group does not control the federal government. When they are out of federal power, they're in favor of states' rights. When they have federal power, they're in favor of a strong national government. The states' rights argument is a consistent political instrument utilized by the politically marginalized in the Republic to protect their interest on the national political scene. States' rights cannot be seen as a credible cause, but a rationalization for succession. Furthermore, if you examine what those interests were that the slave states wanted to protect when they succeeded, they all hinged on the practice of slavery, including holding slaves. Beyond states' rights, you have to examine the economic impact. You have to look broadly at the other issues that were on the table that were beleaguering the Republic in the 1850s. And when you look at the Republic in the 1850s, you look at what are seen as two alien societies. You look at an aggressive agrarian society and an aggressive industrial economy. Two economic systems clashing on taxation, protective tariffs, rail lines, monetary policies, and land policies. These issues all require federal action to resolve. The 3/5 clause in the Constitution padded the slave states. As far as representation in the House of Representatives goes, these disagreements soon these disagreements could not be solved in an absolute or decisive manner by the legislature. These economic issues just bubbled and bubbled and bubbled. These agreements evolved into an internecine struggle for control of the federal government. Now, economic differences, it must be stated, existed since colonial times. It had never led to violence. Indeed, the very different economies were complementary to each other in many ways. Cotton from the slave states, sugar from the slave states, tobacco from the slave states, all made their way to northern or free state mills. Those products from the two very different economic systems had a very reciprocal nature. So all those raw goods produced in the slave states by slave labor were sent to the free states where they were put through the industrial process. Of course, cotton being turned into fabric and clothing, tobacco being, well, you didn't really need much to do with tobacco, but sugar being refined, the molasses from sugar being turned into rum. All of these things, these finished products were then sent back to eager southern markets, along with other northern industrial goods. They had a very reciprocal, a very sort of tandem-like nature. It's almost like riding a bicycle. You know, one pedal goes up, one pedal goes down, one pedal goes up, one pedal goes down. They sort of had that very hand-in-hand aspect. They had that very hand-in-hand reciprocal aspect. And more importantly, the free states were not overly industrial in the 1850s or the 19th century at all. The free states, like the slave states, were overwhelmingly agrarian. And it is here that we will break in our reflection on the Civil War, and we'll come back in our next lecture to really wrap things up with our reflections and our discussions on the United States Civil War. As always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you guys thought about this lecture. Let me know what you guys think about the analysis of the Civil War. I'll see you guys next time for the next lecture.